As a longtime fan of Barbie and a certified pink enthusiast, I've been very excited to see the rise of Barbiecore this year. And I figured, why not make a Barbiecore-inspired outfit for, well, Barbie herself? This project requires a very basic knowledge of sewing, but believe me, if I could make it, then so can you. At the end of this video, you'll find a link to a free printable paper pattern, and a digital version for cutting with a Cricut or silhouette cutting machine can be downloaded from my shop. My pattern is made to fit a Barbie made-to-move petite body, but you can recreate it to fit different types of doll bodies using the kitchen wrap and masking tape technique. This is a really easy way to make patterns, and you can see it better in my previous doll fashion videos. I'll link them at the end of this one. To make this project, you're gonna need fabric in a couple of shades of pink, and personally I used fabric from old clothes. Let's start by making the top. I suggest using a stretchy fabric for this. Cut this part into copy paper and glue it over the fabric of your choice. I used a sticker maker, but double-sided tape will work as well. Measure a few millimeters from the edge of the paper template and trace the second outline. Cut the fabric along this line. Fold the excess fabric over the paper template, and I suggest cutting the fabric into smaller sections to make it easier to fold. Fix these tabs to the paper template with white glue. Now repeat the same steps for this part. Glue the paper template to the fabric, trace the second outline, cut, fold, and glue the edges. Set these elements aside for a moment. Now cut this part and lay it over your fabric. Trace the outline, then remove the paper pattern. Measure approximately half a centimeter from the edge and trace the second outline. Cut the fabric along this line. If you're using my digital templates, you can cut the bigger template directly into fabric and skip this part. Fold the edges along the first outline. Once again, this is easier if you cut the fabric into smaller tabs. Now glue the three elements we set aside earlier to the top's base, starting from the piece at the center and then attaching the left and right sides, like this. Then stitch the hem with pink sewing thread. Ideally, you should aim to do a better job than I did. Now, this is optional, but I decided to stitch all around the edge of the paper parts to add a little additional detail. Wrap the top of your doll's torso, turn it, and mark with a pin the point where the two sides overlap. Then take a couple of snap buttons and fix them to the back of the top. Alternatively, you can use a piece of Velcro. You can either leave the top strapless or add straps using embroidery thread or a ribbon. Put a dot of white glue on one end of the thread and fix it to the front of the top. Glue the second thread to the opposite side of the top. Then turn your doll around and mark the right length for each strap. Finally, glue the straps to the back of the top. Now that the top is ready, we can begin working on the shorts. They're made of the same fabric as the jacket, which we'll make in a moment, so I advise choosing a piece of fabric that is, well, big enough to fit both. I chose this one, and if it seems familiar, it's because it's the same fabric I used to make my miniature suitcase. Cut this part of the pattern and trace it on the fabric. Just like we did for the top, trace the second outline, approximately half a centimeter bigger than the paper template, and cut along this line. You should end up with these two pieces. Place one over the other, front to front, and sew them together along this line. This is what our little shorts should look like at this point. Now, fold the fabric along the pocket seam, folding toward the inner sides of the shorts. And once again, I suggest you cut this hem into smaller sections so that it will fold more neatly. Stitch the hem on both sides of the shorts to create the pockets. Now cut this part, trace the pattern on the fabric, draw a second outline, and cut it. Place this piece over the front right part of our miniature pants, front side against front side, and sew them together along this line. Stop sewing once you reach the pocket, then stitch the little part at the top. Repeat the same steps for this part. Cut it into fabric, making sure to add a 5mm seam allowance. Lay it against the front left side of the shorts and sew across this line. This is what our miniature pants should look like right now. Sew this part on both the left and right side of the back of the shorts. The fabric will take on a somewhat bent shape. Now cut this part and trace the pattern onto your fabric. This time, a seam allowance is not required. Cut the fabric, then sew the resulting pieces to the back of our shorts, behind each side pocket. I suggest stitching along the top and sides of the inner hem. Now, fold the waist of the shorts in half and stitch the hem. Repeat this step for the bottom hem. And make sure you don't sew the legs together, which is something I most definitely did not do myself. It's time to stitch together the front and back sides of the legs. And just a reminder, you'll find the download link to the free printable template at the end of the video, and the digital version for cutting with a Cricut or silhouette cutting machine is in my shop, linked in the description box. To sew the legs, you want to keep your fabric on the reverse side. Fold the back of each leg behind its front part, then sew them together along this line. Repeat these for both legs. This is what our little Barbie pants should look like at this moment. We can now begin working on the back of the pants. Keep the fabric turned inside out and sew the two back sides together until here. Then reverse the fabric. Fold the hem on the pants right side and stitch it. Before we sew the opposite side's hem, let's add a little snap button as a closure for our little pants. Sew one button to the right side of the pants and the other at the very edge of the left side. Then fold the hem on the left side and stitch it. If you want, you can add a couple of belt loops to your doll shorts. I used a piece of the same fabric used for the shorts themselves, carefully folded in 3 parts and then stitched. I suggest using a little bit of fray check to secure the hems. Sew the resulting pieces to the sides of your miniature pants. And by the way, you can find a tutorial on how to make the belt here. Now that our Barbie's shorts are done, we can start making the jacket to go with them. Grab the same fabric we used for the pants and trace this part of the pattern onto it. Then, just like we did earlier, draw another bigger outline around the first one and cut the fabric. This is going to be the back of our little jacket. Repeat the same steps for this part of the template. This is going to be the front of the jacket. Now take the back and 1/2 of the front and lay them one on top of the other, front side against front side. Sew them together along this line. Repeat this step for the opposite side of the jacket's front part. This is what our miniature jacket should look like at this moment. Now cut this part of the paper pattern and trace it onto the fabric twice. Add a 5mm seam allowance and cut along this line. These are going to be the sleeves of our miniature doll jacket. Now lay the front and the back of the jacket on your work surface and place one of the sleeves on top, like this. Attach the sleeve to the jacket's front and back parts by sewing along this line. Repeat this step for the other sleeve. You should end up with this. It's time to stitch together the front and back of our little jacket, sewing along this line. When you reach the base of the sleeve, just keep sewing along this line. Repeat this step for both sides of the jacket. Now we can turn the jacket inside out. Well, technically I guess it's outside in. Fold the collar like this and stitch the hem. Then, fold and stitch the hem on the jacket's front sides. Repeat this step for the bottom hem of the jacket. Now, fold the end of each sleeve inward and stitch this hem as well. Lay down the jacket front side up on your work surface. and measure 4 cm from the bottom on both sides. Pull the fabric from this point up until the base of the sleeves. I would advise pressing the fabric with an iron. Now cut this part of the pattern and trace it on the fabric twice. Cut along this line without adding a seam allowance and secure the edge with a little bit of freight check. You should end up with these two pieces. Attach them to the inner part of the jacket's front sides using a sticker maker or double-sided tape. If needed, you can cut away some bits to make the fabric fit better around the seams. And our Barbiecore inspired doll outfit is ready. As promised, here's the link to the free printable template. And if you're interested in the SVG and Silhouette Studio files, there's a link to my shop in the description box. I suggest you watch this video next to find out how to make a custom dress for any type of doll, starting from scratch. And that's all for today's video. Until next time, bye!